Origin of a myth. Tarot cards can tell the future. Spoiler alert, no they cannot, but how did that odd belief come to be? It's a really interesting and bizarre story. First thing to understand is that you'd be hard-pressed to find a more mundane object that has had more esoteric theories and beliefs grafted onto it than tarot cards. You might also be hard-pressed to find a more mundane object that is more accidentally profound. And tarot cards are useful for meditation and reflection, if you want to call them that. Some therapists actually incorporate them into their practice. Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, among others, at least acknowledged the mythic and psychological potency of the images and the action of using them. But that's very different than believing they can tell you what's in store for you, right? So how did that come about? Well, for one thing, human beings just have a desire to know the future. It's kind of maddening that we don't know what's going to happen. And if you think about it, history is filled with examples of people and cultures trying to find a way to divine the future. Here's a man in South Africa throwing the bones. Here's a rendering of what it might have looked like in the ancient Greek world when people went to consult the oracle at Delphi. Sticking to the classical world, the ancient Romans were obsessed with trying to predict the future. Check out this headline here. The sacred chickens that shaped Roman decision-making. And we know this for a fact. I mean, they do this kind of thing all the time. Is this invasion going to work out? Should we proceed? Consult with the chickens first. Or read the flight of birds, or open up a cow or ox's entrails, etc. Let's look at a close-up of our priestess from Delphi while we mention that. Notice in all of those examples, the person who wants this knowledge goes to somebody else, right? A shaman, a priestess. There was the priest who handled the chickens. He was a high priest. And you can see the idea at play, right? There's a gatekeeper, there's somebody who has specialized knowledge or abilities that you don't, and you have to go to them to tap into the future. Here's a couple of stills from the TV show Vikings, where a character is going to see the seer. S-E-E-R, of course. And this is a global historical pattern. So here, in this day and age, right, here's a fortune teller in Hong Kong. And the tarot card reader, the one who pretends to be able to predict the future, specifically then, is just part of this overall pattern. It's just one little variation of this pervasive pattern. You go to this specialist who has a specialized tool and can use it to tell your future. No, they can't, but you know. Back to our purpose, how did tarot cards become one of those objects, one of those tools? Well, to understand that, you have to know that tarot cards are just one type of playing cards used for divination. The greater practice is called cardomancy, divining through cards, playing cards. And to reiterate a point from other videos, that's all tarot cards were at first. They were playing cards for a game that had nothing to do with fortune telling. They just happened to become the dominant form of divination cards, cardomancy cards, in modernity. And that's why, like in this painting here, this 1895 painting, and in most of the ones you'll see in this video and just anywhere on the internet, if you look at old paintings of people using cards for divination, gypsies, whoever, most of the time, by far, they're holding what we would call regular cards, not tarot cards. Now we have to ask, how did cardomancy start then? Well, first of all, playing cards were invented most likely in China. Here are some examples, obviously. And then that device made its way west. It hit the Islamic world first, became very popular there as well, and then finally made it into Europe. Now, the particular pack of cards and game that caused that transmission were the Mamluk cards. Mamluk, M-A-M-L-U-K, slave soldier, a member of one of the armies of slaves established during the Abbasid era that later won political control of several Muslim states. That included North Africa, and it's from there that the cards made it into Southern Europe. And here's what those cards looked like. Gorgeous, right? You can see the Islamic artistic styling, and anyway, these things made it over in about the 14th century, and they caught on. European versions of these cards started to be made and produced. The four suits were inherited from the Mamluk cards. The only difference is that the sticks from the North African cards became clubs in the European cards. That's because the sticks were polo sticks, and in Europe they didn't know what polo was. Here's a painting of a polo game from Persia. Meanwhile, coins, cups, and swords worked just fine. Playing games with cards is now a hit in Europe, particularly with the aristocracy, because at first there weren't, mass production techniques to get real cheap packs out there. Regardless, this was a new, fun diversion. People liked playing games of all sorts back then, just like they do today. And the thing with a pack of cards is, it's so much easier to carry than a chessboard or whatever. And by the way, they had other board games back then too. And games that were remarkably similar to some that you're familiar with from your childhood, but that's another subject. And now, whether from the foreign influence or not, regardless, the thing is, cards really quickly began to be used for secondary purposes, like gambling. That's why this guy's cheating here. This is probably no surprise. People have always loved to gamble on games of chance, but what maybe is a surprise is that in Europe, they very quickly started using the cards for fortune-telling. A lot of people will say that the gypsies, the Roma, brought playing cards and/or tarot cards and/or cardomancy into Europe. That's wrong on all counts. The Roma arrived in Europe after all of those were already things on the European continent. The confusion partly stems from the fact that the Roma were quick to seize upon cartomancy as yet another way to get money out of rubes. So many of them put across the idea that this was a special cultural practice of theirs, or that they are the ones that brought these to Europe. A little bit of a tangent there, but a related one, and by the way, how great is this vintage image? Speaking of rubes, they're alive and well, like the people who pay for this service here, where a tarot reader online will read your name and question about your future or potential future baby, use the cards to then divine the guaranteed future, and let you know. Are you going to have children? When? What kind? Whatever. This is, of course, pure nonsense, but it works. As a business model, that is. Go through the comments and you'll see all these satisfied customers, people crying about, now I know I'm going to have a little girl someday. It's really sad, in fact. Back to our timeline, though. In Spain, cards are called naipes. They were then, and they are now. You're looking at some old examples here, of course. And it may be here on the Iberian Peninsula that European cardomancy started. I'm going to read excerpts from a paper entitled History of Cardomancy. Playing cards first appeared in Europe in the 1360s. They were in Spain by 1371. Writing from the Spanish court around the year 1450, Fernando de la Torre described how with a special form of naipes he had designed, players could, quote, tell fortunes with them to know who each one loves most and who is most desired, end quote. So you see cards being used in what I think of as a very playful and courtly way, you know, someone's in love with you but they haven't admitted it yet, that kind of a thing. Honestly, there's a very direct link with this kind of a thing and the kinds of games girls played when I was a kid. In grade school, you know, who are you going to marry and when are you going to get married? And you'd use cute little devices like this to figure that out. But how did playing cards pretty quickly become adopted as a fortune-telling tool in Europe? Well, most likely because of their Mamluk card inspiration. Some of them, the court cards, had little aphorisms and sayings printed on them. A couple of phrases here. Quote, as for the present that rejoices, thy heart will soon open up, end quote. And another, quote, I will, as pearls on a string, be lifted in the hands of kings, end quote. If we were going to look to a modern object that we can compare this to, I would actually pick fortune cookies. In other words, it's kind of just a bonus, right? So those sayings were just a bonus to the cards, the Islamic cards. How seriously you took them was up to you, and my guess is people didn't take them very seriously at all. Remember, they were printed on objects that were strictly a game-playing instrument. And the new versions of those instruments made in Europe, which were clearly copies of the Mamluk cards originally, brought that aspect over as well. And people like this would use them for fun. But the fun turned serious when people started to take seriously the cards' abilities, right? So here's a quote from that same paper we were talking about before. There are no clear accounts of how fortune-telling with cards was done until about a century and a half later, but in the meantime cards were sometimes listed with dice and other methods as kinds of sortilege, a term sometimes meaning witchcraft in general, but specifically divination. And this is part of why the church frowned upon cards. You're not supposed to look to anything for answers about the future because only God knows the future. So it is therefore a form of witchcraft. Here, looking at this Renaissance gambling hall, you see people playing in the cards in the upper left. That's the other reason the church didn't like it, because gambling was a vice and cards were used for gambling. Back to fortune-telling, during the Inquisition, we have the documented records, we know that people were convicted for using cards for fortune-telling, so it was a forbidden practice. It was usually, if not always, a woman, by the way, who was busted as being the card-using fortune teller. And so we've clearly graduated to at least some people taking the power of the cards seriously. The next 4 card images I'm going to show, I say card images because there's going to be an interlude of an ancient manuscript, are cards from the Visconti Sforza deck. These are the oldest tarot cards in existence from about the middle of the 1400s. They were commissioned by the Duke of Milan, who is part of the Visconti family, and this coincides with the best thoughts on when tarot was invented, early to mid 15th century. And by the way, around this time in Europe and in these succeeding centuries, divination games in Europe were a thing with and without cards. So they had these little booklets which were popular, and you could, consult the book. It would have a different method for figuring out how to, know what your future is going to be, whatever. And sometimes those books, the instructions, incorporated cards. Let's recap a few points. Tarot cards were not the first playing cards in Europe. They were not the first cards in Europe to be used for cardomancy, nor were they the first divination object to be used there. Far from it, right? That was a very ancient practice. To be fair, we cannot say for a fact that tarot wasn't invented for divination purposes. But there's absolutely no evidence that it was, and that's odd because since this was a prevalent thing, fortune-telling with books, fortune-telling with cards and books, we have evidence of all of that. Why would we not have any about this one supposed variation? And that's why all sober, sane researchers agree that tarot was, in all likelihood, designed as a simple game. A game that is still played to this day in parts of Europe. What made this game very novel and therefore a hit was the use of the trumps. 3 of which you're looking at right now and 3 of which come in the next image. These were a set of unnamed, unnumbered cards, as you can see, that really broke with the visual pattern and the systematic pattern of regular playing cards. So you had this set of 22 images like this that were then married to a standard pack. That equaled the game of Trionfi or Tarot. Trionfi is triumph in Italian, and this was the novel part of the gameplay. These cards, these characters, could triumph, could trump over other cards. The card makers did not come up with these images or this sequencing in a vacuum. They leveraged what would be culturally obvious to the users. I mean, how else would you get users to adopt this game? Users like this image, often to be said the oldest depiction of people actually playing tarot. And remember, the trumps were unnamed and unnumbered, so their scenes, their characters, and their sequencing had to be culturally obvious for people. It's a visual story that the users could easily follow along with. What that story is, I've dealt with in other videos, but just because it was obvious doesn't mean it isn't interesting or profound. So it's this allegorical journey of life, as ours and all of ours headed towards the end of times. Here are the standard 21 trumps in their most common visual representation, the Marseille pattern, most common representation throughout tarot history, but not that popular anymore. They tell that story that I was talking about, and then the wild card, literally and figuratively, is of course the 22nd, which is the Fool. Here he is starting off the tarot sequence as eventually became common, so he was the only unnumbered of the 22, and that's how you get the 1 plus the 21. And as you can tell, the major arcana did eventually get numbered. But anyway, what's important to us is that if playing cards themselves were already, for some reason, found to be useful for trying to divine the answers to questions and trying to see into the future, imagine then when you had a deck of cards, the total tarot deck, these 22 plus the regular 56 cards, what happens when you have a set of cards that includes these allegorical, often deific images? Here's a gallery somebody kindly put together for us of very early death cards from tarot. Obviously, in my opinion, these would be even more prone to the divination type use, and that I think is the key to them eventually becoming the predominant form of cardomancy card, to the point where today people think that only tarot cards are used that way, and that they were invented for that purpose. Here is a direct quote from 1527. Yesterday, Gilberto, Falcone, and Mirtella secretly led me into a room where, since they'd found playing cards of trumps, they dealt these according to chance among themselves, and having turned toward me, each one of them explained to me the specific destiny of the trumps received, entreating me to write a sonnet about them for each person. To the best of my knowledge, that is a fictionalized encounter, but the author obviously knew about tarot and using them to divine answers. And remember, this is less than 100 years after the invention of these kinds of cards, so pretty quickly, taking the historic long view, pretty quickly they found this new use. And now let's do a live demonstration, no planning, on how these cards work so well for this use or misuse. Somebody pulls a card for me. Of course, I'm pulling for myself. The Tower. That's a scene of disaster. Uh-oh. Something bad is going to happen to me. Well, I want to know what. What does it relate to? So they pulled another card for me. Ooh, the Lover's card. Okay. It's about relationship trouble. There's 3 people on the card. I can't decide if I want to get back with my old girlfriend or stay with my new one. What's going to happen? Gold coins, money. Yeah, that's what my old girlfriend and I used to fight about all the time. I felt like I always had to buy her presents. And that's what's going to happen if I reunite with her. Oh, someone's going to bring you a present. Oh, okay. Who? Your mother, or some kind of woman who's an authority figure. That card is the Empress. Let's change that reading. You soon will be taking a present to a woman of authority. Hey, Mother's Day's coming up. You're right. What else? The magician or the juggler. Somebody is deceiving you in your life. Magicians deceive you, they trick you. This is a street performer here on this card. Symbol of deception, at least in part. Ooh, somebody's deceiving me. I don't like that. Who could it be? The Pendu, the hanged man, symbol of suspension, being stuck. Hey, I've felt stuck at work recently. Am I being tricked by my boss? Ooh, the Pope, a male figure of authority. My boss is a man. Yes, that's him. He's never going to give me that promotion he promised. I knew it. You've been thinking about some business venture. Oh, yes, I have. Odds are pretty good, at least in some way. You can rationalize that. Well, the cards say it's going to turn out well. There's a vision of your future self, right? The young man thinking about money, the older man who has money. But don't forget, you're going to die. So money isn't everything. What you need to do is, next card, think about your relationships. Hey, you're right, I have been neglecting my relationships because I've been so focused on getting ahead at work or starting up my business or whatever. Someone's mad at you. They're holding a sword. The sword is red. Someone who has power. This is a king. Oh, that's a problem. Cups, by the way, real quick, are a symbol of feelings, and they feel a lot of resentment towards you. The person equates that with someone in their life, some past situation, but how's it going to turn out? Oh, they get to you. They kill you. We're going real old school, purely predictive mode at that time. So imagine some count getting a reading and, oh yeah, the Duke of Milan really hates me. Wow, I knew he wanted to kill me. Or at least I suspected it. Oh no, and he's going to succeed. Or maybe it means that one of us must die. Well, guess I better hire an assassin to go kill him first. You're looking at a really fascinating tarot deck here, by the way, the famous Solabusca, my pronunciation. The first complete set that was obviously a radical artistic departure. Anyway, everything I've talked about thus far adds up to why the myth exists that tarot cards can read the future. It exists because it happens to accidentally fit really well this mold of this constant historic human need to find answers about the future from gatekeepers who have a specialized tool/skill set. The Roman high priest, hey, only I can read the chicken entrails, so you gotta come to me. And then to defend a tarot for just a second, a reader could be well-intentioned and say, these are this really interesting set of visual prompts, like I've talked about before, and they can help you think through a problem. Here, I'll draw them for you and explain what they mean. And then you associate them to your question or problem. And then on the far more cynical end, you have the flat-out scammers who, hey, I'm a psychic, and I can use these magic cards to tell you what's going to happen to you in the future. These cards that were invented for aristocrats in the early Renaissance to entertain themselves with. Of course, I don't tell you that part. Most of them don't know that part. They prefer to either believe in or pretend they believe in a fake alternate history of the cards. They go all the way back to ancient Egypt. No, they don't. They are a coded version of the Kabbalah. No, they're not. No, that's not right. They're an encoded version of suppressed Neoplatonic teachings, or an expression of astrology. Wrong and wrong. Just name an esoteric pre-Christian belief system, and chances are somebody will say the cards were designed with that in mind. Like I said at the start of the video, you probably won't find a more mundane object with more esoteric theorizing forced onto it. But all of this adds to its appeal as a supposedly supernatural object, because if it does have this encoded, ancient wisdom and secret behind it, well then, oh, that's why it can connect to the spirit world, or the future, or the spirits who you contact through the cards, who can then, of course, actually read the future. So regardless, the icing on the cake on all of this is, how you saw in the demo, the cards are a kind of a wonderful storytelling machine. In fact, I'd say strong corroboration of our hypothesis is that the tarot deck we're looking at here, the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot deck of the early 20th century, the fact that it became by far the most popular in history and the one that really kind of exploded the use of tarot cards for divination across the globe, its breakthrough came about, I would say, because, even though it wasn't the first one to do this, it put a scene or character on every single card, on all 78, not just the 22 trumps. With a picture or a scene, a character or a scene on every card, people found it much easier to tell these predictive stories. Predictive but unpredictable, because you never know what cards you're going to get as you draw. Predictive, at least if you're deluded enough to think that a set of cards with some illustrations on them can literally tell the future. Anyway, that is how this myth came to be. Thanks for watching.